The Grand Assembly Hall of the Kael'thir Union was a place built to make small things feel smaller. Its ceiling rose higher than any cathedral on old Earth, held up by pillars carved from stone, found nowhere on any single world, because the stone itself had been grown in orbit, layer by layer, over 300 years. Light did not come from lamps here. It came from the walls themselves, soft and blue, like the inside of a glacier. Every species that walked through those doors felt the weight of that light. It said, without words, that this place had existed long before you, and would exist long after you were gone. The ambassador Elena Voss had walked through those doors 11 times in the last 2 years. She no longer felt small, she felt tired. Today she stood at the base of the speaker's platform, a raised circle of black glass in the center of the hall, surrounded on all sides by tiered seating that held representatives from over 200 species. The Drask sat in their heavy pressure suits, breathing thick amber gas that leaked in slow curls whenever they moved. The Yin floated in clusters of 3, their bodies joined by thin silver threads, so that no Yin ever spoke without its 2 partners agreeing first. The Corvi, tall and insectile, clicked their mandibles together in a rhythm that other Corvi understood as laughter, and that humans had learned, through hard experience, usually meant they were being mocked. Elena did not look at any of them. She looked straight ahead, at the presiding speaker, an old Thren male named Doros Kell, whose skin had gone the pale gray of extreme age, and whose 4 eyes blinked out of sync with each other, in a way that still unsettled her, even after 2 years of practice. "The Terran ambassador has the floor," Doros Kell said. His translator device gave his voice a flat, metallic calm that did not match the slow tiredness in his real voice underneath it. "Please be brief. The assembly has 40 more items on today's docket." Elena inhaled once, slowly, the way her old drill instructor had taught her years ago, back when she'd been a young naval officer and not a diplomat. "Breathe before you speak. Words said in a rush are words said badly. Honored members of the assembly," she began. "I come before you again, not to ask for aid, and not to ask for trade concessions, though Earth would welcome both. I come to warn you. Sensor arrays, maintained by the Terran Deep Space Monitoring Division, have detected unusual gravitational disturbances along the outer edge of the Kest corridor, consistent with a mass fleet movement of unknown origin. These disturbances match, almost exactly, patterns recorded 300 years ago by the last surviving witnesses of the Threll extinction." A murmur ran through the hall. Not fear. Boredom. Elena had learned to tell the difference. "The Threll extinction," Doros Kell repeated, and one of his 4 eyes rolled slightly, a Thren gesture that Elena's cultural briefings told her meant polite disbelief. "Ambassador Voss, the Threll extinction is considered, by every serious historian in this assembly, to be a myth. A ghost story told by frightened colonists 3 centuries ago, to explain a series of unrelated disappearances, later attributed to pirate activity and rogue asteroid mining accidents. With respect, Speaker Kell, that conclusion was reached without access to the sensor data my people have gathered. Human instruments were not part of this galaxy 300 years ago. We were still finding our footing in our own solar system, but we have that data now, and it does not match pirate activity. It does not match mining accidents. It matches something moving in formation, something large. Something that broadcasts no transponder signal, answers no hailing frequency, and leaves gravitational wakes consistent with vessels far larger than anything currently catalogued in this galaxy's known fleets." The Corvi delegation clicked their mandibles. Laughter. A representative from the Drask rose, his suit hissing amber gas as he shifted his weight. His translator voice was a deep rumble, slowed down and flattened by the machine into something that still managed to sound condescending. "Ambassador Voss, your species has been part of this assembly for 2 years. 2 years, out of a civilization that measures its diplomatic history in millennia. You arrived here with primitive, slower-than-light engines, only recently improved by technology gifted to you by the Yin Collective, out of charity, because your species could not survive first contact with the wider galaxy without it. And now you stand before this body and tell 200 civilizations that a legend is real, based on instruments your own scientists built, without any outside verification." Elena kept her voice level. It was harder than it looked. "The instruments were built by human engineers, yes, But the mathematics behind gravitational wake analysis were developed jointly with Wayne researchers, 8 months ago, in the Prox Station Observatory. Under a formal research exchange, this assembly itself approved. I would ask the Yin delegation to confirm this. All eyes turned to the cluster of 3 silver-threaded yin seated near the back of the tier. They conferred silently, the threads between them pulsing faintly with light, a sign of active communication. After a long pause, one of them spoke, its voice thin and layered. 3 voices speaking as one. The mathematics are sound. The data is real. We do not dispute the ambassador's instruments. A flicker of hope rose in Elena's chest. But, the yin continued, sound mathematics can still be applied to an ordinary phenomenon and produce an extraordinary conclusion, if the observer is inclined toward extraordinary conclusions. We do not confirm the Threll extinction is occurring again. We confirm only that gravitational disturbances exist. Their cause remains unknown. The hope died as quickly as it had come. Doros Kell folded his long gray hands together. Ambassador Voss, the Assembly appreciates your vigilance. Truly. Young species are often the most alert to danger, having not yet learned which dangers are worth losing sleep over. But this body cannot divert fleet resources, cannot issue system-wide alerts, cannot disrupt trade routes carrying medical supplies to 14 worlds currently experiencing crop failures, on the basis of gravitational static and a children's story. Then let me ask for something smaller, Elena said quickly, before he could move to the next agenda item. Not a fleet deployment, not an alert, just permission for Earth to place additional sensor buoys along the Kest corridor, at Earth's own expense, monitored by Earth's own personnel, reporting only to Earth. We are not asking the Assembly to act. We are asking the Assembly not to stop us from watching. This, at least, seemed reasonable enough that no one immediately objected. Doros Kell glanced left and right along the high tiers, reading the room in that old, practiced way that every experienced politician in every species seemed to share. The Assembly will vote on the buoy proposal at the end of session, he said. For now, Ambassador, your time is spent. Please step down. Elena stepped down from the black glass platform. As she walked back to the small alcove reserved for the Terran delegation, she passed close to the Drask representative, who leaned toward her, his suit hissing. A word of advice, Ambassador, he rumbled. Species that cry wolf too many times find their voices carry less and less weight, until one day, no one looks up at all, even when the wolf is real. I've cried wolf exactly once, Ambassador Rule, Elena said quietly. This is the first warning Earth has given this Assembly. I intend it to be taken seriously, because I intend for it to be the only one you get before you see the wolf for yourselves. She did not wait for his response. She walked to her seat and sat down, and for the first time in the session, allowed herself to look tired in front of 200 alien species, who had already decided, months ago, exactly how seriously to take a species that had only been flying between the stars for a single human generation. 300 light-years away, in a converted asteroid mining station that had once belonged to a bankrupt Belgian corporation and now served as Deep Space Monitoring Station 7, a young technician named Marcus Webb sat very still in front of a bank of screens, his coffee going cold beside his elbow. He had been staring at the same data stream for 11 minutes. Chief, he said, not taking his eyes off the screen. Chief, I need you to look at this. Chief Warrant Officer Priya Nagata crossed the small control room in 4 steps and leaned over his shoulder. On the screen, a field of stars shimmered with the faint, familiar static of deep space background radiation. But threaded through that static was a pattern, subtle, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for, a rhythmic ripple in the gravitational field that pulsed every few seconds like something breathing. That's not the same signature from the Kest corridor, Priya said slowly. No, ma'am. It's closer. 19 light-years from Sol, just past the edge of the Ashfall Belt colonies. Priya's face went very still. How many? Marcus's hands were shaking slightly as he pulled up the analysis overlay, the computer working to separate individual gravitational sources from the combined wake pattern. Numbers scrolled past. A count appeared at the bottom of the screen, then updated again as the software refined its estimate. The system's still working on it, but current estimate is... He swallowed, Current estimate is between 400 and 600 vessels, ma'am. Moving in tight formation. No transponder signal. No response to automated hailing protocols. Course heading puts them on a direct line toward the Ashfall colonies within 11 days. Priya Nagata had served in the Terran Navy for 22 years. First in the old chemical rocket fleet before the Yin technology transfer, and then in the new fleet after, when human ships had suddenly gained engines that could fold space instead of merely burning through it. She had seen pirates. She had seen a rogue asteroid mining accident that had killed 40 people. She had never, in 22 years, seen a gravitational wake pattern like the one now crawling across her screen. "Get me a secure line to Fleet Command," she said, "and get me a line to the ambassador's office in the assembly hall. Priority override." She needs to see this before she walks back into that chamber. Marcus's hands moved fast over the console. "Chief, if this is real, if this is actually—" "I know what it might be, Marcus." Priya's voice was flat and controlled, the voice of a woman keeping her fear locked very carefully in a box. "Get me those lines. Now." 600 light-years in the other direction, in a part of the galaxy that no assembly star chart had ever properly mapped, something vast moved through the dark between stars. It did not travel in ships in the way that humans understood ships, vessels built by hands, welded and riveted and wired together by engineers who slept and ate and worried about deadlines. It moved as a single, continuous mass, thousands of individual forms fused at the edges into something that was not quite a fleet and not quite a single organism, but some strange and terrible thing in between. It had a purpose, encoded so deep into whatever passed for its collective mind, that the purpose no longer needed to be a thought at all. It simply was, the way gravity simply was, the way the pull of a black hole did not need to want anything in order to consume everything that came too close. 300 years ago, it had passed through this quadrant of the galaxy once before. It had left behind the empty husks of 17 worlds, the burned-out shells of civilizations that the current assembly no longer even remembered by name, filed away as unsolved mysteries, ancient history, ghost stories told to frighten young species into behaving. Now it was returning. And ahead of it, scattered and small and utterly unaware of what they measured themselves against, lay the newest arrivals to galactic civilization, a species that called itself human, that had been flying between the stars for barely 20 years, that the rest of the galaxy had already decided, with the easy confidence of the old and the powerful, was not worth listening to. They were about to be very, very wrong. Back on Earth, in a fortified command bunker beneath the Colorado Mountains, a very different kind of meeting was already underway, one that no alien species had been invited to, one that had been running in secret for the better part of 6 years, ever since the first faint, unconfirmed gravitational echo had reached human sensors. Admiral Rebecca Cho stood before a holographic display, showing a fleet the assembly did not know existed, a fleet built quietly, patiently, in shipyards hidden in the asteroid belt and in the shadow of Jupiter's moons, using every scrap of Yin technology Earth had been given, combined with a ruthless, focused human genius for building weapons that the galaxy's older, gentler civilizations had simply forgotten how to build. "They didn't believe us," Cho said quietly, to the room of officers and engineers gathered before her. "Fine, we didn't build this for them to believe us. We built it because someday, believing us wasn't going to matter anymore. Someday, only being ready would matter." She looked at the fleet numbers scrolling beside the holographic display. Not 400 ships, not 600. 2,140. "Someday," Admiral Cho said, "just became today." Back in the assembly hall, Elena Voss felt her wrist communicator buzz against her skin. A soft, insistent pulse that meant priority override, a signal reserved for only the most urgent messages. She excused herself quietly from the Terran alcove and stepped into the narrow corridor behind the tiered seating, where the hall's ever-present blue light gave way to the dimmer, more ordinary lighting used in the service passages. She opened the message and read it twice before she let herself believe it. Gravitational wake pattern detected 19 light-years from Sol, estimated 400 to 600 vessels, heading directly for Ashfall Belt colonies, ETA 11 days. This is not a drill. Her hands went cold. The Ashfall Belt was not some distant uninhabited system. It held 3 human colonies, small ones, agricultural outposts founded only 4 years ago, home to just under 12,000 people who had left Earth to build a quieter life among the stars. 12,000 people, with no military defenses beyond a handful of unarmed patrol cutters meant for tracking asteroid debris, not repelling an invasion fleet. She thought about walking back into the assembly hall right then, interrupting the session, standing on the black glass platform, and shouting the numbers at all 200 delegations until someone, and Column, was forced to listen. But she had learned enough about the assembly in 2 years to know exactly how that would go. They would ask for more data. They would form a subcommittee. They would schedule a follow-up session in 6 weeks to review preliminary findings, and by then, the Ashfall colonies would already be gone, one way or another, and the assembly would express its condolences and perhaps issue a formal statement of sympathy, and nothing else would change. She sent a reply instead, short and precise. Understood. Contact Fleet Command directly. Evacuate Ashfall Belt immediately, using all available civilian and reserve transport. I am staying here to keep pushing for the buoy vote, and anything else this body will give us. Do not wait on the assembly. We act alone if we must. Then she straightened her jacket, took a breath, and walked back into the hall. The vote on the sensor buoys came 2 hours later, near the end of the session, after the assembly had worked its way through disputes over mining rights in a contested nebula, a trade agreement between 2 insect species regarding rare mineral exports, and a lengthy, bitter argument about whether a particular species of gas giant-dwelling organisms qualified as sapient enough to warrant a seat in the assembly at all. By the time DeRoss Kell called for the vote, half the delegates looked as tired as Elena felt. All those in favor of granting the Terran delegation permission to place additional sensor buoys along the Kest corridor, at their own expense, reporting only to their own government? Lights flickered across the hall as delegates cast their votes through their translator devices. Elena watched the tally rise on the great display above the platform. It passed, but barely. 98 in favor, 74 opposed, the rest abstaining, too indifferent to bother forming an opinion on a matter that concerned, in their view, nothing more than one young species being unnecessarily anxious about noise in the dark. It was a small victory. It felt like nothing at all, compared to what she now knew was already 11 days away from 12,000 of her own people. As the session broke and delegates began filing out of the hall, murmuring to each other in 100 different languages that the translators rendered into a low, layered hum, Elena remained seated, staring at the empty black glass platform. Ambassador Rule of the Drask passed by her alcove once more, his suit hissing softly. "You look troubled, Ambassador Voss," he said. "I hope my earlier words were not too harsh." "Your words were fine, Ambassador," Elena said, standing to meet his eyes, or the closest equivalent behind his suit's dark faceplate. "I hope, for your sake and everyone else's, that you remember exactly what you said to me today. I have a feeling you're going to want to think about it again very soon." He tilted his head, a gesture she couldn't quite read, and said nothing more before moving on. 11 days later, on the outer edge of the Ashfall Belt, the sky above the colony of New Meridian tore open. It did not happen with fire or thunder, not at first. It happened in silence, the terrible silence of deep space, as the first of the alien mass emerged from behind the pale gold disk of the system's second moon, a shape so large that for a full 3 seconds, the automated planetary defense sensors simply failed to register it as a single object, instead reporting dozens of separate contacts, before finally, in a burst of frantic recalculation, merging them into one impossible reading. By then, the evacuation was already 3 days underway, ships loaded past regulation limits, families crammed into cargo holds meant for grain and mining equipment, the last transports lifting off from New Meridian's single spaceport, even as the ground began to shake from tremors that had nothing to do with the planet's own geology, and everything to do with something enormous entering its upper atmosphere. Marcus Webb, still stationed at Deep Space Monitoring Station 7, watched the feed come in, delayed by the long crawl of light-speed communication, already 20 minutes old by the time it reached his screen. He watched New Meridian Spaceport go dark on the sensor display, one green transponder light after another simply vanishing. Not exploding, not burning, just vanishing, the way a candle flame vanishes when someone closes their hand around it. "Chief," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chief, I think we just lost contact with the last transport out of New Meridian. Priya Nagata did not answer right away. She was staring at the same screen, at the same emptiness, where 12,000 human lives had been, doing the terrible arithmetic that every soldier eventually has to do, counting losses instead of gains. How many got out? She finally asked. Marcus checked the manifest logs, cross-referencing against the evacuation fleet's last confirmed departure count. 9,412, ma'am. Confirmed boarded and departed before the contact was lost. 9,412 saved, 2,588 not. It was, by any measure, a successful evacuation, faster and more complete than anyone had dared hope for, given only 11 days of warning and a colony with almost no military infrastructure of its own. It did not feel like success to Marcus Webb, sitting alone at his console with his cold coffee, watching a planet's lights go dark, one by one, on a screen 200 million miles from the nearest living soul. In the Colorado bunker, Admiral Rebecca Cho received the same report within the hour, relayed through a chain of secure channels that bypassed the Assembly's own communication networks entirely, because Earth's leadership had stopped trusting those networks the moment the first gravitational echo had been confirmed 6 years ago. She read the casualty numbers twice, the way Elena Voss had read the warning message twice, needing the second reading to make the first one feel real. Then she turned to the officer beside her, a woman with silver hair and the kind of stillness that only came from decades of hard command. "Signal the fleet," Admiral Cho said. "All 2,140 ships. Full activation. We are done building in secret. We are done waiting for permission from an assembly that would rather watch us burn than admit they were wrong to ignore us." "And the assembly, Admiral? Do we notify them?" Rebecca Cho looked at the star map spread across the holographic table, at the small blue marker representing Earth, surrounded by 200 other markers representing species who had spent 2 years deciding that humanity's warnings were beneath their attention. "No," she said. "Let them find out the same way New Meridian found out. Let them look up into the sky and see for themselves, for the first time in 300 years, exactly what it looks like when humanity stops asking politely and starts doing something about it." Far above the ruins of New Meridian, in the cold dark between the stars, the vast alien mass continued on its slow, patient path deeper into the galaxy, utterly unaware that it had just done something no diplomat, no ambassador, and no assembly vote had managed to do in 2 long years. It had finally made humanity's warning impossible to ignore. News of New Meridian reached the assembly hall 3 days after it happened, not through any official channel, but through a leaked sensor recording that made its way onto the galaxy's public data networks and spread faster than any government could contain it. By the time Doros Kell called an emergency session, every delegate in the chamber had already watched the footage at least once, a colony's lights going dark, one by one, while a shape too large to properly measure moved across the stars above it. Elena Voss stood on the black glass platform again, but this time, no one in the hall looked bored. 2,588 confirmed dead, she said. Her voice did not shake. She had promised herself, on the long flight back from Earth after receiving the news in person, that her voice would not shake in front of this assembly, no matter what it cost her to keep it steady. 9,412 evacuated in time, only because Earth acted on its own warning, without waiting for this body's permission. I stood on this platform 11 days before it happened, and told you a fleet was coming. I asked for sensor buoys. I did not ask for intervention, because I already understood that this assembly would not grant it. I only asked to be allowed to watch the danger coming, so that at least my own people could prepare. She let the silence stretch, just long enough to be uncomfortable. You granted that request, barely, by a margin of 24 votes. And because of that narrow margin, 12,000 people had 11 days of warning, instead of none. I want every delegation in this hall to sit with that number for a moment. 24 votes. That is how close you came to letting an entire colony vanish from the universe without a single second of warning. Ambassador Rule of the Drask rose from his seat, his suit hissing more heavily than usual. A sign, Elena had learned, of genuine agitation rather than the practiced calm he usually wore. Ambassador Voss, the Drask Compact extends its deepest sympathies to the Terran people for this tragedy. No civilized species takes pleasure in the loss of innocent life, but sympathy is not the same as culpability. This assembly did not create the threat that destroyed your colony. We cannot be held responsible for failing to act against an enemy whose existence could not be confirmed until it was already upon you. Its existence could have been confirmed, Elena said sharply, if this assembly had authorized a proper investigation into the Threll extinction records, the moment Earth first raised concerns. Instead, you called it a children's story. You called our instruments unreliable. You told me, personally, that species who cry wolf too many times find their voices carry less weight. I cried wolf exactly once, Ambassador Rule, and an entire colony paid the price for how this assembly chose to respond. The Corvi delegation did not click their mandibles this time. No one in the hall found anything to be amused by anymore. Duroskel raised one gray hand, a gesture that in Thren body language meant a request for order, and the murmur running through the tiered seats slowly quieted. His 4 eyes, usually blinking out of sync in that unsettling way, were now all fixed on Elena, unmoving. Ambassador Voss. The assembly convened this emergency session specifically to address the New Meridian tragedy and determine an appropriate collective response. What is Earth requesting of this body today? Elena had rehearsed this moment on the flight over, had written and rewritten the words a dozen times, trying to find the version that would actually move 200 species, who had spent 2 years treating her people as an interesting curiosity rather than an equal partner. In the end, she had settled on the simplest version she could manage. A formal declaration of galactic emergency. Authorization for a unified defense fleet, drawn from member species willing to contribute ships and crew, under joint command, to intercept and engage the threat before it reaches any other inhabited system. And full data sharing access to any historical assembly records related to the Threll extinction, so that we can understand exactly what we are facing, instead of guessing based on 300-year-old ghost stories. The hall fell into a different kind of silence now, not the bored, dismissive silence of 2 weeks ago, but the heavy, calculating silence of 200 governments each doing the same mental arithmetic. How much would this cost us, and what do we get in return? It was the Yin delegation that spoke first this time, their silver threads pulsing rapidly with the light of urgent internal deliberation, before their triple voice rang out across the chamber. The Yin Collective supports the formation of a joint defense fleet in principle. However, we note that the enemy's exact nature, capabilities, and numbers remain unknown. Committing ships to an engagement against an unquantified threat carries significant risk. We propose, instead, a joint reconnaissance mission to gather further data before committing to direct engagement. With respect, Elena said, reconnaissance takes time. The enemy fleet did not slow down to let New Meridian evacuate more of its people. It will not slow down while this assembly gathers more data. Every day we spend debating whether to act is another day that fleet moves closer to its next target, and we still don't know where that target will be. A new voice entered the debate, one Elena did not immediately recognize, from a delegation seated high in the back tiers, representing a species called the Merenth, tall, silver-skinned beings who rarely spoke in assembly sessions and whose worlds lay along the galaxy's inner rim, far from both Earth and the outer Kest corridor. The Merenth Compact wishes to know, the delegate said, her translated voice cool and careful, whether Earth's request for a joint fleet is truly about defending the galaxy, or whether it is an opportunity for a young, ambitious species to seize military authority over established powers under the cover of a crisis. Elena felt anger rise in her chest, hot and immediate, and forced herself to breathe before responding, the way she had been trained to, all those years ago. Ambassador, 2,588 of my people are dead. I am not standing on this platform because I want authority over your fleets. I am standing here because I do not want to attend another emergency session in 2 weeks, mourning another colony, listening to another delegation express sympathy while offering nothing else. If you doubt Earth's intentions, then do not put Earth in command. Put anyone in command. Put a Merenth admiral in command, if that would ease your suspicion. I only ask that someone, somewhere, actually be given the authority to act, before the next warning comes too late for anyone to listen to at all. The debate continued for nearly 4 more hours. Elena stood through most of it, answering questions, deflecting accusations, watching as delegation after delegation weighed the cost of action against the cost of inaction, as if New Meridian's ashes were simply another line item in a very long budget. By the time Duras Kell finally called for a vote on the Joint Defense Fleet proposal, Elena's legs ached, and her voice had gone hoarse. The vote failed. Not by a wide margin, but it failed. 106 opposed, 92 in favor, the rest abstaining. Too many delegations, still shaken by the cost of committing military resources to an unconfirmed threat, chose caution over action, exactly as they had chosen dismissal over vigilance 2 weeks earlier. Elena stood on the black glass platform after the vote was announced, and for the first time in 2 years of representing her species in this hall, she said nothing at all. She simply looked around at the tiered seats, at 200 species who had just watched a recording of a colony's lights going dark, and had still, somehow, found a way to vote no. Then she stepped down from the platform, walked out of the assembly hall, and did not look back. Aboard the Terran flagship Endeavour, in orbit around Earth's moon, Admiral Rebecca Cho received Elena's report in real time, transmitted through the same secure channels that had carried word of the fleet's activation days earlier. They voted no, Cho said quietly, reading the summary twice, the way she had read the New Meridian casualty numbers twice, needing the second pass to make the words settle into something she could actually act on. "Ma'am," said her aide, a young lieutenant named Sarah Okafor, standing beside the holographic star map that dominated the Endeavour's command deck. "Does this change the deployment plan?" Cho studied the map for a long moment. 2,140 ships, arranged in careful formations across the display, already moving into position along the projected path of the alien mass, based on gravitational tracking data that Marcus Webb and his colleagues at Deep Space Monitoring Station 7 had been refining every single day since New Meridian fell. The enemy fleet's course, once extrapolated, suggested a clear next target, the Thren homeworld itself, ancient Thren Prime, seat of the very assembly that had just voted against defending it. "No," Cho said finally, "it changes nothing. We committed to this fleet 6 years ago, when nobody outside this room believed the threat was real. We are not going to stop believing it now, just because 200 alien governments are too busy protecting their budgets to protect their people. Even Thren Prime, Admiral? After everything they've said about us, after they called our warnings ghost stories." Rebecca Cho turned away from the star map and looked at her young lieutenant with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but something that sat uneasily between the two. "Lieutenant, I did not spend 6 years building this fleet so that I could watch an entire species die, because their politicians were foolish and their diplomats were cowards. Somewhere on Thren Prime, right now, there are children who have never voted for anything, who have never sat in that assembly hall, who are simply going to school or playing with their families, with absolutely no idea that a fleet is coming for them. Those children did not vote no. I am not going to let them pay for the sins of an assembly that failed them." She turned back to the star map, tracing the projected path with one finger. "Signal the fleet. New primary objective. Intercept the enemy mass before it reaches Thren Prime. We move at maximum speed, effective immediately. And the assembly, Admiral? Do we request permission to enter Thren space?" Rebecca Cho allowed herself a thin, tired smile, the first genuine expression of anything other than grim resolve that Lieutenant Okafor had seen from her in days. "No, Lieutenant. We tried asking permission for 2 years. It cost us New Meridian, and it very nearly cost us Thren Prime too, while they argued about budgets. This time, we are not asking. We are simply going to be there when they need us, whether they ever admit they needed us or not." Far ahead of the human fleet, deep in the space between Thren Prime and the outer colonies, the alien mass continued its slow, patient advance, its course now bending, subtly but unmistakably, toward the ancient homeworld of the very species that had spent 3 centuries dismissing the danger it represented as nothing more than a story told to frighten children. Aboard Deep Space Monitoring Station 7, Marcus Webb watched the updated trajectory calculations scroll across his screen and felt a strange, cold certainty settle over him, the kind of certainty that came only after weeks of watching numbers you desperately wished were wrong. "Chief," he said, "it's not slowing down. And it's not changing course. Whatever's driving that thing, it's heading straight for Thren Prime, ETA 9 days. Priya Nagata leaned over his shoulder, studying the same numbers, doing the same terrible arithmetic she had done for New Meridian. Except this time the population figures attached to the target world ran into the billions instead of the thousands. "Get me Fleet Command," she said. "Admiral Cho needs to see this the second it's confirmed. And Marcus, keep this data flowing to the Assembly's public networks too. Let it leak the same way New Meridian's footage leaked. Let every delegation in that hall see exactly what's coming for their precious ancient homeworld, whether their ambassadors want them to see it or not." Marcus's hands moved fast across the console, routing the data through a dozen different channels, some official, some decidedly not. Somewhere, in the quiet hours before the next assembly session, on data terminals across 200 worlds, a new set of numbers would begin appearing. Numbers that no amount of diplomatic caution could argue away. Numbers that would finally, make the galaxy understand exactly what humanity had been trying to warn them about for 2 long years. The Warfleet was already moving. The only question left was whether the galaxy would be ready to see what humanity had built in the silence, while everyone else had been busy calling their warnings a children's story. On Thren Prime itself, in a modest apartment overlooking the capital city's ancient stone towers, a young Thren student named Sela Korth was doing exactly what Admiral Cho had imagined some nameless child might be doing, utterly unaware of the fleet bearing down on her world. She was studying for an examination on old Thren history, reading a passage about the Threll extinction from a textbook that described it, in careful academic language, as an unsolved mystery of little modern relevance, a curiosity for historians, rather than a warning for the present. She had heard about New Meridian, of course. Everyone had. The footage had played on every public news channel for days, grainy and terrible, a colony's lights blinking out one by one. She had felt sad about it, the distant sadness a person feels for tragedies that happen to strangers on worlds they will never visit, and then she had gone back to her studies, because the examination was in 4 days, and her professor did not accept excuses about events 300 light-years away. She did not know that the same shape which had darkened New Meridian's sky was now bending its course toward her own world. She did not know that a fleet of 2,000 human ships, built in secret over 6 years by a species her own government had spent 2 years dismissing as primitive and overly anxious, was already burning through the dark between the stars, racing to reach her homeworld before the enemy did. She simply closed her textbook, made herself a cup of warm tresh tea, and went to bed, thinking about nothing more urgent than tomorrow's lecture on trade law. Duras Kell did not sleep well that night. He rarely did, these days, though he would never have admitted as much to any of his fellow delegates. He sat alone in his private chambers within the assembly complex, all 4 of his eyes open despite the late hour, staring at a data terminal that had, over the past 6 hours, begun filling with the same gravitational tracking figures that Marcus Webb had released onto the public networks. He was old enough to remember, faintly, second-hand stories his own grandmother had told him about the Threll extinction, stories she herself had heard from her grandmother, passed down not as history but as folklore, the kind of tale told to frighten young Thren into finishing their studies and behaving themselves. He had never truly believed it. No serious scholar had, not for over 2 centuries. It had been easier, always, to file it away as myth, the same way a human parent might tell a child about monsters under the bed, understanding all along that the monster was never real. Now the numbers on his terminal told a different story. 9 days. Thren Prime. A shape too large to properly measure, closing in on the oldest and most cherished world in the entire assembly. The world that housed not just billions of his own people, but the very assembly hall itself, the seat of 200 species shared government, 3 centuries of accumulated diplomatic history, art, and memory, all of it sitting directly in the path of something that had already erased an entire human colony without slowing down. He thought about Elena Voss, standing on the black glass platform, her voice steady even as she described the deaths of her own people. He thought about how he had called her warnings a children's story 2 weeks earlier, using almost the exact words his own grandmother had once used to describe the very extinction event that was now, apparently, bearing down on his homeworld with terrible, patient certainty. He picked up his private communicator and, for the first time in his long career as presiding speaker, placed a direct call to the Terran embassy, bypassing every layer of formal protocol that would normally govern such contact. Elena Voss answered on the second ring, her voice thick with exhaustion. Speaker Kell, it's the middle of the night. I am aware, Ambassador. I would not have called if the matter were not urgent. He paused, choosing his words with the same careful precision he had spent decades perfecting in the assembly hall, though this time the words came harder than usual. I have seen the tracking data. I understand it originated from your monitoring stations and was released onto public networks, rather than submitted through official channels. It was released because official channels move too slowly to save anyone, Speaker Kell. I imagine you understand that better than most, after tonight. He did not argue the point. The Assembly will reconvene an emergency session in 6 hours. I intend to bring the Joint Defense Fleet proposal back to a vote, and this time, I intend to support it publicly, which I did not do previously. I am calling to ask you directly, Ambassador, without the theater of the Assembly Hall around us, does Earth still have ships capable of responding to a threat of this scale? Or was your request for a joint fleet born from desperation rather than genuine capability? There was a long pause on the line, long enough that Doros Kell wondered if the connection had failed. When Elena finally spoke again, her voice had changed, the exhaustion still present, but layered now with something else, something that might have been the first real hope she had allowed herself to feel in 2 years. Speaker Kell, I am going to tell you something that very few people outside my own government currently know, something I was not authorized to share until this moment, but which I believe you deserve to hear before you walk back into that chamber in 6 hours. She took a breath. Earth has not been asking the Assembly for a joint fleet because we lack ships of our own. We have been asking because we hoped, foolishly perhaps, that this galaxy might choose to stand together before it was forced to. As of this evening, Earth's warfleet is already moving toward Thren Prime. 2,140 vessels, currently 9 days from your homeworld, exactly matching the enemy's estimated arrival time. Doros Kell sat very still, all 4 eyes wide, processing a piece of information that rewrote everything he thought he understood about the young species his assembly had spent 2 years underestimating. 2,000 ships, he said slowly. Built by a species that has only possessed interstellar travel for 20 years. Built by a species that watched 3 centuries of your assembly's history, Speaker Kell, and understood, faster than any of you seemed willing to, that a galaxy without teeth eventually gets eaten by something with plenty of its own. We did not build that fleet to threaten anyone. We built it because we were the only ones paying attention to what the Threll extinction records were actually trying to tell us, 300 years too late for anyone else to listen. Doros Kell closed his eyes, all 4 of them, for a long moment. When he opened them again, something in his ancient, tired face had shifted, some old certainty finally giving way to a newer, harder truth. Then I owe you an apology, Ambassador Voss, and I intend to offer it publicly, before the full assembly, in 6 hours' time. Whether that apology means anything to you or your people after what you have already suffered, I cannot say, but I would like to make it nonetheless. Speaker Kell, Elena said quietly, save your apology. Save it for the moment our fleet actually arrives at Thren Prime, and does what your assembly was too frightened and too slow to do for itself. That is the only apology that will matter to anyone, on any world, watching this unfold. Words are cheap. We learned that lesson from this assembly 2 years ago. Let your actions be the ones that finally speak differently. The line went quiet. Doros Kell sat alone in his chambers, watching the tracking numbers continue their slow, inevitable countdown, and for the first time in 3 centuries, the ancient stories his grandmother had told him did not feel like folklore at all. They felt like a warning his entire civilization had failed to heed, until a young species barely 20 years into the stars had heeded it for them. The emergency session convened 6 hours later, exactly as Doros Kell had promised. But this time, the assembly hall looked different. The tiered seats, usually filled with delegates murmuring quietly to one another, sat almost silent. Every screen in the chamber, normally reserved for procedural documents and voting tallies, now displayed the same live feed, a real-time tracking map showing 2 converging fleets, one vast and unknown, one smaller, but growing clearer by the hour, as human sensor data continued streaming in, both racing toward Thren Prime along intersecting paths. Doros Kell stood on the black glass platform himself this time, rather than presiding from his usual seat above it, a break from 300 years of assembly tradition that seemed to unsettle the delegates almost as much as the tracking map itself. "Members of the Assembly," he began, his translated voice carrying none of its usual flat calm. "6 hours ago, I called Ambassador Voss of Earth in the middle of her night to ask her a question I should have asked 2 weeks earlier, on the day her people first warned us of the danger now bearing down on our own homeworld. I asked her if Earth possessed the capability to respond to a threat of this magnitude. Her answer humbled me, and I believe it should humble every delegation in this hall." He gestured, and the tracking map on the great display above the platform shifted, zooming out to show the full scope of the human fleet's formation, ship markers stretching across the display in numbers that made several delegates lean forward in their seats. 2,140 vessels, Doroskel said, built by a species that has possessed interstellar flight for barely 20 years. Currently 9 days from Thren Prime, moving to intercept the enemy fleet before it reaches our homeworld. Earth did not wait for this assembly's permission. Earth did not wait for a vote. Earth acted, the moment the threat became clear, exactly as they tried to warn us they would need to, 2 weeks ago, when we called their concerns a children's story. A heavy silence fell across the hall. Ambassador Rule of the Drask, who had once told Elena that species who cried wolf too many times found their voices carrying less weight, sat very still in his seat, his suit hissing softly, saying nothing at all. "I move," Doroskel continued, "that this assembly formally recognize Earth's fleet as the designated defense force for the current crisis, and that every member species offer whatever support, resources, and coordination Earth requires to succeed in protecting Thren Prime and any subsequent targets. I further move that this assembly issue a formal apology to the Terran delegation for its failure to act on their warnings, both regarding New Meridian and the current threat to our own homeworld." Elena Voss, standing once more in the Terran alcove, felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for 2 years. She did not smile. There was still too much at stake for anything as simple as relief. But for the first time since walking into this hall as an ambassador, she felt the weight of 200 species' attention shift from dismissal to something that finally resembled respect. The vote passed almost unanimously, 189 in favor, only a handful abstaining, none opposed. Even the Marinth delegate, who had once questioned whether Earth's warnings were merely a bid for power, rose to cast her vote in favor, her cool, careful voice now carrying an unmistakable note of urgency. Aboard the Endeavour, 7 days out from Thren Prime, Admiral Rebecca Cho received word of the Assembly's vote with the same flat, focused calm she had carried through every stage of the fleet's activation. She did not celebrate. She had learned, over 6 years of quiet preparation, that celebration belonged after a battle was won, not before it had even begun. "They've recognized us as the Defense Force, Admiral," Lieutenant Okafor reported, reading from the incoming transmission. "The Assembly's offering full logistical support, access to their deep space relay network, and they're asking whether we'd accept additional ships from member species willing to contribute to the effort." Cho studied the tracking map, watching the two converging fleets draw slowly closer together across the vast dark distance that still separated them from Thren Prime and from each other. "Decline the additional ships, for now. We don't have time to integrate unfamiliar vessels into our formations before contact, and mismatched command structures get people killed in the middle of a fight. Accept the relay network access. We'll need every scrap of sensor coverage we can get once we're close enough to engage." "And the apology, Admiral?" The Assembly's formal statement specifically named Earth's original warnings, the ones they dismissed 2 weeks ago. Cho allowed herself a brief, tired smile. "Forward it to Ambassador Voss. She's the one who stood in that hall and took the insults for 2 years. Let her decide what an apology is worth, after everything it cost to earn one." She turned back to the star map, tracing the projected intercept point with one finger, a location in open space, roughly 2 days' travel from Thren Prime itself, chosen specifically so that if the battle went badly, the enemy fleet would still have to fight its way past 2,000 human ships before it ever reached the homeworld's atmosphere. "Fleet-wide briefing in 1 hour," she said. "I want every captain, every squadron commander, fully briefed on the engagement plan before we're close enough for the enemy to notice us coming. We do not get a second chance to choose our ground on this one." The briefing that followed was unlike anything most of the assembled captains had experienced in their careers, not because the tactics were unusual, but because of the sheer, grim clarity with which Admiral Cho laid out exactly what the fleet was facing. "We do not fully understand what we're fighting," she said, standing before the holographic display that now showed the enemy mass in far greater detail than the crude gravitational wake analysis of 2 weeks earlier. Long-range sensors, pushed to their absolute limits, had finally begun resolving individual shapes within the mass. Vessels, if they could even be called that, fused together at strange angles, their hulls a dark, matte material that swallowed sensor pings rather than reflecting them cleanly. What we do understand is this. It moves in a single coordinated mass rather than independent ships acting under separate command. It does not respond to hailing signals of any kind, in any language, at any frequency, and based on the new meridian engagement, it does not appear to negotiate, retreat, or divert from its chosen path under any circumstances we have yet observed. A murmur ran through the assembled captains, gathered both in person aboard the Endeavour and via secure hologram from ships scattered across the vast formation. "Which means," Cho continued, "that this will not be a battle we win through clever diplomacy or a well-timed retreat. This will be a battle we win, if we win it at all, through overwhelming, coordinated force, applied with absolute precision, at a single point in space we choose in advance, before the enemy ever reaches a world it can do further damage to." She outlined the plan in careful detail. 3 concentric formations, an outer screen of fast interceptor vessels, designed to harass and divide the enemy mass before it could bring its full weight to bear. A middle line of heavy cruisers, equipped with the newest generation of yin-derived energy weapons, refined and improved by 6 years of dedicated human engineering, and an inner core of the fleet's most powerful vessels, the Dreadnought-class ships that Earth had built in near-total secrecy, each one carrying enough firepower to level a moon, held in reserve for the moment the enemy's formation showed its first sign of weakness. "I will not pretend this is a battle without risk," Cho said, her voice carrying to every ship in the fleet through the secure channel. "We may lose ships, we may lose people we know personally, friends, crewmates, family members serving aboard other vessels in this formation. I cannot promise any of you that everyone who begins this engagement will see the end of it. What I can promise is this. We did not build this fleet in secret, over 6 long years, so that we could watch another new meridian happen, while we stood by and did nothing. We built it because somebody had to be ready, and the rest of this galaxy, for 200 years and 200 species, chose not to be." She paused, letting the weight of that settle across the assembled captains. Thren Prime does not know how close it came to sharing New Meridian's fate. Billions of people are going about their lives on that world right now, utterly unaware of what's bearing down on them, the same way New Meridian's people were unaware, 11 days before their sky went dark. We have a chance, right now, to make sure that world gets to keep its people, its history, its future. I intend to take that chance, and I am asking every one of you to take it with me. Across 2,140 ships, in control rooms and command decks and engineering bays, captains and crews absorbed the weight of what was coming. There was fear in some of their faces, the honest, human fear of people who understood exactly what they were about to face. But there was something else too. Something that had been quietly building in the 6 years since the fleet's construction began, in the 2 years since Earth had first tried and failed to warn a galaxy that refused to listen. A sense that this moment, whatever it cost, was the moment humanity had been quietly preparing for all along. 2 days before the projected intercept point, Marcus Webb sat at his console aboard Deep Space Monitoring Station 7, watching the same tracking data that now filled screens across 200 worlds. The enemy mass had grown large enough on long-range sensors that individual vessel shapes were now clearly distinguishable, thousands of them, fused and clustered in formations that defied easy human categorization. "Chief," he said quietly, "I've been running comparison analysis against every recorded engagement we have data for, going back through everything the Yin shared with us during the technology transfer. I don't think anyone in this galaxy has ever actually fought this thing and survived to record how the battle went." Priya Nagata studied the same data, her expression carefully neutral, the way it always was when she was working hard to keep her own fear from showing. The Threll extinction records? Fragmentary at best. Whatever happened 300 years ago, nobody who saw it up close lived to describe it in any useful detail. We're about to become the first data point anyone's ever collected on how to actually fight this thing. Marcus rubbed his eyes, exhausted from days of near-constant monitoring. No pressure on the Admiral or anything. Priya placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a small human gesture of reassurance that felt strange and necessary against the vast, cold scale of what they were both watching unfold on their screens. She's had 6 years to prepare for exactly this moment, Marcus. Longer than that, if you count the years before we even had solid proof the threat was real, when she was still fighting to get the fleet approved and funded against half the Terran government's own objections. If anyone in this galaxy was ready to be the first data point, it's Rebecca Cho and the people she's built this fleet with. On the screen between them, the two fleets continued their slow, inevitable convergence, day by day narrowing the vast dark distance that still separated them, until finally, with less than 12 hours remaining before contact, the enemy mass began, for the first time since its emergence near New Meridian, to change its formation. Marcus watched the shift ripple across his display, the loose, sprawling mass tightening, reorganizing, thousands of individual shapes drawing closer together into something that looked less like a slow migration and more like a fleet preparing for battle. "Chief," he said, his voice suddenly tight, "I think it knows we're coming." Word of the enemy's shifting formation reached the Endeavor within minutes, relayed through the same chain of secure channels that had carried every critical update since the fleet's activation. Admiral Cho studied the new data in silence, standing before the holographic display with her hands clasped behind her back, the posture she had worn through every difficult decision of her long career. "It's tightening its formation," she said finally. "Consolidating. That's not the behavior of something migrating blindly through space. That's the behavior of something preparing to meet an opposing force." "Could it be reacting to Thren Prime's own planetary defenses, Admiral?" Lieutenant Okafor asked. "Bracing for atmospheric engagement? Thren Prime's defenses are civilian-grade at best, built to handle asteroid debris and the occasional pirate raid, nothing close to a real military deterrent." "No, Lieutenant. I think Marcus Webb's assessment is correct. Whatever intelligence guides that mass, it has detected our approach, and it is preparing to meet us before we ever reach Thren Prime's orbit." She turned to face her assembled bridge crew, "which tells us something important. This is not a mindless force moving on pure instinct. There is decision-making happening within that mass, coordination, response to external stimulus. We are not fighting a weather pattern. We are fighting an enemy that can adapt." The bridge fell quiet, each officer absorbing the weight of that realization. An enemy that adapted was infinitely more dangerous than one that simply crashed forward along a fixed path, and every tactical assumption built into Cho's original engagement plan now needed to be re-examined in the few remaining hours before contact. "Recalculate the intercept formations," Cho ordered. "Assume the enemy will attempt to counter our outer screen the moment they identify it as a threat, rather than allowing our interceptors to harass their flanks unopposed. I want contingency patterns ready for at least 3 different enemy counter formations, and I want every squadron commander briefed on all 3 before we're within engagement range." For the next several hours, the fleet's tactical teams worked without rest, running simulation after simulation against the newly observed enemy behavior, refining formations, adjusting weapon allocation, stress testing every assumption that had gone into 6 years of careful planning. Admiral Cho moved from station to station across the Endeavor's command deck, reviewing each team's work personally, offering corrections where needed, but mostly simply present, a steady, calm figure whose confidence, however carefully constructed, helped hold the nerves of everyone around her. Near the end of the briefing cycle, she found a quiet moment to step into the small observation alcove just off the main bridge, a narrow space, with a single transparent viewport looking out into the dark. She stood there alone for several minutes, watching the distant, cold light of stars, that had no idea what was about to happen in the space between them. She thought about the officers who had argued against building this fleet at all, 6 years ago, when the gravitational data was still faint and uncertain, when funding it meant diverting resources from 100 other, more immediately useful projects. She thought about the long nights spent convincing a skeptical Terran government that a threat nobody else in the galaxy took seriously was worth mortgaging years of national budget to prepare for. She thought about New Meridian's dark, silent spaceport, and about Sela Korth, the young Thren student she would never meet, sleeping soundly on Thren Prime, with no idea how close her world had come to sharing New Meridian's fate. "Everything we built," she said quietly, "to no one but the stars, was for exactly this moment. Let's not waste it." Then she straightened, turned away from the viewport, and walked back onto the bridge, where 2,140 ships, carrying tens of thousands of human lives, waited for her final orders, before the galaxy's first real battle, against an enemy it had spent 3 centuries pretending was only a story. "All ships," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the fleet-wide channel. "Final approach in 6 hours. Rest if you can. Check your systems twice, and remember why we're here. Not for glory, not for conquest, and not to prove anything to an assembly that spent 2 years refusing to listen to us. We're here because somewhere behind us, there are people who don't even know they need saving yet. Let's make sure they never have to find out the hard way." Back in the assembly hall, the tracking display continued its silent countdown, watched now by delegates who had spent 2 years learning to ignore Earth's warnings, and were only now beginning to understand exactly what they had almost lost through their own caution. Elena Voss stood in the Terran alcove, watching the same numbers, her exhaustion pushed aside by a tension that made sleep feel impossible. Duras Kell approached her quietly, his 4 eyes dimmed with the particular weariness of a leader, carrying more weight than he had ever expected to bear. "Ambassador Voss, I find myself, for the first time in 3 centuries of Thren diplomatic service, entirely uncertain of what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything, Speaker Kell," Elena replied, not unkindly. "In about 6 hours, a lot of people are going to find out exactly what humanity is capable of, for better or worse. Words won't change what happens next. Only the fleet will. And if the fleet fails?" Elena did not answer immediately. She looked at the tracking display, at the small cluster of markers representing 2,140 human ships, moving steadily toward a battle that no one in this galaxy, human or otherwise, had ever truly prepared for. "Then Thren Prime falls the way New Meridian fell," she said quietly, "and this assembly will finally understand, far too late, exactly what it cost to spend 2 years deciding whether or not a young species warning was worth taking seriously. But I don't believe it will fail, Speaker Kell. I've met the people who built that fleet. I've watched Admiral Cho plan for this exact moment for 6 years, long before anyone else believed it was coming. Humanity does not build things by half measures, not when we finally understand what's at stake. You're about to see that for yourselves." Around them, the assembly hall's usual murmur of diplomatic conversation had faded into something closer to held breath. 200 species watching the same countdown, waiting to see whether the fleet they had once dismissed as unnecessary anxiety would prove to be the only thing standing between their ancient homeworld and the same silent, dark fate that had already claimed New Meridian's 12,000 people. The hours ticked down. Somewhere in the space between Thren Prime and the stars beyond it, 2 fleets, one ancient and unknowable, one young and fiercely determined, drew closer to a battle that would decide far more than the fate of a single world. The battle began the way most great battles do, not with a dramatic first shot, but with a long, tense silence, as 2 forces closed the last remaining distance between them. Each side committed. Each side past the point where retreat remained a real option. Admiral Rebecca Cho stood on the Endeavor's command deck, watching the enemy mass fill more and more of the tactical display with every passing minute. Up close, at last within full sensor range, the true scale of the thing became clear, in a way that no amount of gravitational wake analysis could have properly conveyed. It was not simply large. It was wrong, in a way that made even hardened naval officers glance away from the display and back again, unable to quite process what they were looking at. Thousands of individual vessel shapes fused together at the edges into something that pulsed and shifted like a single living creature, its dark, matte hull swallowing sensor pings and reflecting almost nothing back. "Range to enemy formation, 300,000 kilometers in closing," reported the Endeavor's tactical officer, a sharp-eyed commander named Diego Alvarez, who had spent the last 6 years training exclusively for a battle he had never truly believed would come. "Outer screen is in position, Admiral. Interceptor squadron standing by. Signal all ships," Cho said. "Execute formation Delta. Outer screen. Begin your approach on my mark." Across the vast formation, 200 fast interceptor vessels broke from the fleet's main body, arcing outward in a wide, sweeping pattern designed to draw the enemy mass's attention and divide its response before the heavier ships of the middle and inner formations came within engagement range. These were the fleet's smallest, quickest ships, built for speed and maneuverability rather than raw firepower, crewed by pilots who had spent years training in simulators for an enemy no one had ever actually seen fight. "Enemy mass is responding," Alvarez reported, watching the tactical display shift in real time. "It's splitting, Admiral, breaking into 3 distinct subformations, each one moving to intercept a different section of our outer screen." Cho's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Confirmed independent tactical response. It's not just adapting, it's dividing its own force intelligently, the same way we would. Alvarez, adjust interceptor patterns, contingency 2. Do not let any single subformation isolate our ships. The first shots of the battle came moments later, not the clean, precise energy weapon discharges of the human fleet, but something stranger, thin lances of dark, distorting energy that bent the space around them as they traveled, striking 2 of the outer screen's interceptor vessels almost simultaneously. Both ships vanished from the tactical display within seconds, not exploding in the way a human weapon might destroy a target, but simply crumpling, folding inward on themselves, as if the space they occupied had briefly ceased to properly exist. "We just lost the Meridian's Grace, and the Wolverine," Alvarez said, his voice tight but controlled. "Crew status unknown. Whatever that weapon is, it's not conventional energy or kinetic damage. It's doing something to local spacetime itself. Casualties? No confirmed survivors from either vessel, Admiral." Cho absorbed the loss without visible reaction, though something behind her eyes hardened further. 42 lives, gone in the first exchange of a battle that had barely begun. Continue the engagement pattern. Interceptors. Draw their attention. Don't engage directly. Let them commit to the chase. For the next 20 minutes, the outer screen executed exactly the strategy Cho and her tactical teams had spent 6 years refining. Fast, evasive interceptor squadrons weaving through the enemy's dark lance fire, drawing the 3 subformations further and further from their original tight cluster, spreading the enemy's numbers thin across a wide arc of space, exactly as planned. The cost was real. 12 more interceptor vessels fell to the strange, space-time folding weapons before the maneuver was complete, each loss registering on the tactical display as a small, silent absence where a green marker had been moments before. But the plan worked. By the time the enemy's 3 subformations had fully committed to pursuing the scattered outer screen, they had drawn far enough apart from one another that Cho's middle formation, the heavy cruisers carrying 6 years of refined Yin-derived weapon technology, found clear firing lanes on each isolated cluster. "Middle formation in position," Alvarez reported. "All cruiser squadrons report weapons hot and ready. Admiral." "Fire," Cho said, her voice flat and absolute. The response was immediate and overwhelming. 600 heavy cruisers unleashed coordinated volleys of focused energy fire, each blast calibrated through 6 years of careful engineering to punch through the enemy's strange, sensor-absorbing hull material. Where human weapons struck, the dark matte surface of the enemy vessels did not simply crack or burn, but rather seemed to peel away in sheets, revealing something pale and pulsing beneath, something that looked, disturbingly, more organic than mechanical. "We're punching through," Alvarez said, a note of grim satisfaction entering his voice for the first time since the battle began. "Enemy subformation 2 is taking heavy structural damage. Several individual contacts are breaking away from the mass entirely, drifting, no longer responding to whatever coordination signal binds the rest of them together. They can be hurt," Cho said quietly, almost to herself. "Good. Continue concentrated fire on subformation 2. I want it broken before it can regroup with the others." Aboard one of the middle formation's heavy cruisers, the Constitution, Captain Maria Reyes gripped the arms of her command chair as her ship shuddered under the recoil of its own weapons fire, watching through the forward viewport as pale, pulsing shapes finally began breaking away from the enemy mass under sustained bombardment. "Direct hit on the primary contact," her weapons officer called out. Captain, it's not fighting back the same way anymore. Whatever coordination held that cluster together, I think we broke it." Reyes watched as the isolated enemy shapes, no longer moving with the eerie, unified purpose of the larger mass, began drifting erratically, some firing wild, unfocused shots that missed by wide margins, others simply tumbling through space, as if the intelligence that had guided them had abruptly gone dark. "Finish them," she ordered. "Concentrated fire. All remaining contacts in subformation 2. Don't let a single one regroup with the main mass." It took another 11 minutes of sustained fire to fully destroy what remained of the isolated subformation. 11 minutes in which the Constitution and its sister cruisers methodically dismantled dozens of the enemy's strange, part-organic vessels, each one crumpling and going dark under concentrated human firepower. When the last contact finally vanished from the tactical display, a ragged cheer went up across the Constitution's bridge, quickly silenced by Captain Reyes's raised hand. "Save it," she said. "We've got 2 more subformations still out there, and the main mass hasn't even fully engaged yet. This isn't over." On the Endeavor's command deck, Admiral Cho watched the tactical display shift as subformation 2 collapsed under the middle formation's concentrated assault, but her attention remained fixed on the 2 remaining enemy clusters, both of which had begun, in the last several minutes, showing signs of a disturbing new behavior. "Admiral," Alvarez said, his voice suddenly urgent, "subformations 1 and 3 are converging. They're not pursuing our interceptors anymore. They're moving to reinforce each other, and their new combined heading puts them on a direct intercept course, with our inner formation." Cho's eyes narrowed as she studied the projected trajectory. The inner formation held the fleet's most powerful ships, the Dreadnought-class vessels that represented the single greatest concentration of firepower Earth had ever built, held in careful reserve for exactly the moment when the enemy's true strength might be tested. If the 2 remaining subformations combined their strength and struck the inner formation directly, before the middle formation's cruisers could redeploy to support them, the battle's outcome would hinge entirely on whether Earth's newest, least tested warships could withstand a concentrated assault from an enemy that had already demonstrated it could adapt its tactics in real time. "They're learning from subformation 2's destruction," Cho said slowly. "They understand now that isolated clusters get destroyed. They're combining strength specifically to avoid that fate." She turned to Alvarez, her expression hardening into something absolute. "Redirect the middle formation, full burn, intercept course, to support the inner formation before contact, and signal Dreadnought Squadron Command. Tell them to prepare for direct engagement. This is the moment we built those ships for." Across the vast dark of the battle space, 600 heavy cruisers broke from their engagement with the shattered remains of subformation 2 and surged forward at maximum acceleration, racing to reach the inner formation before the combined weight of the enemy's 2 remaining clusters could strike home. Ahead of them, 40 Dreadnought-class vessels, each one carrying enough firepower to level a moon, began powering up their primary weapon systems, their crews bracing for a battle that would decide, in the next several minutes, whether Thren Prime would share New Meridian's fate, or finally see the threat turned back for good. The 2 enemy subformations, now fully merged into a single mass nearly as large as the fleet's original combined force, closed the remaining distance with terrible speed, dark, distorting lancefire lighting up the battle space, in patterns that bent starlight around their edges. Admiral Cho watched the tactical display with the same flat, focused calm she had carried through every stage of the fleet's activation. 6 years of preparation, now condensed into a handful of critical minutes that would determine everything. "All Dreadnought squadrons," she said, her voice carrying clear and absolute across the fleet-wide channel. "Hold position, let them come to us, and when they're close enough that every shot counts, show this galaxy exactly what humanity built, while everyone else was busy calling us primitive." The combined enemy mass closed the final stretch of distance in under 3 minutes, its dark, pulsing form filling more and more of the Endeavor's forward viewport with every passing second. Aboard the Dreadnought Titan's Reach, flagship of the Reserve Squadron, Captain James Whitfield watched the same terrible shape grow on his own tactical display, and felt his hands tighten on the arms of his command chair. "Range, 50,000 kilometers in closing," his weapons officer reported. "Enemy lancefire is intensifying. Admiral Cho's fleet-wide order still holds. We are not to engage until they're within optimal range." "Understood," Whitfield said, forcing his voice to stay level despite the tension coiling through every nerve in his body. Hold position. Trust the plan. It was, he knew, the hardest kind of order to follow, the order to wait, to hold fire, while an enemy, that had already crumpled 2 ships out of existence in the battle's opening minutes, closed steadily toward point-blank range. But Admiral Cho had spent 6 years designing the Dreadnought's weapon systems around a very specific principle. Their primary armament, a devastating focused energy weapon, capable of tearing through even the enemy's strange, part-organic hull material, required several seconds of charge time between each shot, and drew enormous power reserves that made rapid, undisciplined firing wasteful and potentially catastrophic to the ship's own systems. Every Dreadnought captain had trained for years to resist the instinct to fire early, to wait, patiently, until the shot would count for everything. 20,000 kilometers, the weapons officer called out. 15, 10. Steady, Whitfield murmured, watching the range counter tick down with an agonizing slowness that belied how quickly the actual distance was closing. 5,000 kilometers. Admiral Cho is signaling fleet-wide. All Dreadnought squadrons, weapons free. Fire, Whitfield said, and 40 Dreadnought-class vessels unleashed their primary weapons in a single, coordinated volley that lit up the battle space like a second sun. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Where the middle formation's cruiser fire had peeled away the enemy's dark hull material in sheets, the Dreadnought's concentrated energy beams punched straight through entire sections of the combined mass, vaporizing dozens of individual vessel shapes in each successive volley. The strange, pale, pulsing material beneath the enemy's outer hull, once exposed, proved catastrophically vulnerable to sustained energy discharge, entire clusters of the enemy formation collapsing inward and going dark within seconds of contact. "We're tearing through them, Admiral," Alvarez reported from the Endeavor's command deck, his earlier grim satisfaction now bordering on disbelief. Enemy formation is fragmenting, multiple subclusters losing coordination entirely. Some contacts are attempting to flee the engagement zone. Admiral Cho watched the tactical display with fierce, focused intensity, tracking the collapse of the combined enemy mass as Dreadnought squadron after Dreadnought squadron poured concentrated fire into its weakening formation. Do not let them regroup and do not let them retreat toward Thren Prime. Cut off every escape vector. If this thing survives today, it comes back stronger and smarter next time, and next time, it might not give us 6 years to prepare. The battle's final phase lasted nearly 2 hours, a grinding, methodical process of isolating and destroying each fragment of the enemy mass as it broke away from the collapsing whole, the human fleet's coordinated firepower proving, again and again, more than sufficient to overwhelm an enemy that had never before faced a force capable of matching its strange, adaptive intelligence with equal parts discipline and raw technological power. By the time the last major enemy contact vanished from the tactical display, crumpling into stillness under a final volley from the Titan's reach, the vast, dark mass that had once erased an entire human colony from existence had been reduced to scattered, inert debris, drifting silently in the space where a battle for a galaxy's future had just been decided. "Confirm final enemy contact destroyed," Alvarez said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and disbelief in equal measure. "Admiral, I'm not reading any remaining coordinated activity anywhere in the engagement zone. It's over. We did it." Rebecca Cho stood very still on the Endeavor's command deck, staring at a tactical display now filled almost entirely with the calm, quiet markers of her own fleet, scattered across a battlefield finally emptied of the enemy that had haunted humanity's deep space monitoring stations for 6 long years. "Casualty report," she said quietly. "Confirmed losses across the full engagement, 63 vessels destroyed, primarily interceptor and light cruiser classes from the outer screen. Estimated crew losses in the range of 1,100 personnel. Final numbers still being confirmed as search and rescue operations begin across the debris field." Alvarez paused, his voice tightening. "It's not nothing, Admiral, but given what we were facing, and given what happened at New Meridian with almost no defense at all, it could have been so much worse." Cho closed her eyes for a long moment, holding the weight of 1,100 names she did not yet know, would likely never fully learn, families across Earth and its colonies, who would soon receive the news that changed their lives forever. Then she opened her eyes again, and turned to face her bridge crew, her voice steady once more. "Begin search and rescue immediately. full fleet resources, no exceptions, and signal Thren Prime, and the Assembly Hall. Tell them the threat that erased New Meridian, and nearly reached their own homeworld, has been destroyed. She paused, looking out through the forward viewport, at the drifting silent debris field, all that remained of an enemy that had terrorized this quadrant of the galaxy for 3 centuries. Tell them humanity kept its promise. We told them a wolf was coming, and when the galaxy refused to listen, we made sure the wolf never got the chance to prove us wrong. On Thren Prime, in the modest apartment overlooking the capital city's ancient stone towers, Sela Korth woke to the sound of her communicator chiming with an emergency broadcast alert, something she had never once heard in her entire life. She sat up in bed, groggy and confused, and activated the small screen mounted on her wall, expecting news of a natural disaster or an industrial accident. Instead, she watched footage of a battle she had known nothing about, fought in the space just beyond her own world's outer orbit, while she slept peacefully, unaware. She watched human ships, thousands of them, tearing through a dark, terrible enemy mass that the broadcast identified, with careful, sober language, as the true cause of the Threll extinction 3 centuries ago, and the same force that had destroyed a human colony called New Meridian only weeks earlier. She watched the final moments of the battle, the last enemy contact crumpling into stillness, and then a brief statement from Admiral Rebecca Cho herself, relayed through the Assembly's own broadcast network, her voice calm and tired, and utterly without triumph. To the people of Thren Prime, and to every world watching this broadcast, Cho said, "You do not know most of us, and until today, many of you did not believe the danger we warned you about was real. That's all right. We did not fight this battle for recognition. We fought it because inaction costs lives, and we had already lost enough of our own people to understand that cost firsthand. Rest easy tonight. The threat that was coming for your world has been destroyed, and to any other world, any other species, listening to a young civilization try to warn you of a danger you cannot yet see for yourselves, please, listen a little faster than this galaxy listened to us." Sela sat in her bed for a long time after the broadcast ended, her history textbook still open on the desk beside her. The passage about the Threll extinction, now reading less like a curious historical mystery, and more like a warning her own people had spent 3 centuries choosing not to hear. She thought about the human colony called New Meridian, about 12,000 people she had never known, some of whom had not survived long enough to be saved. She thought about how close her own world had come to sharing their fate, saved only because a species barely 20 years into the stars had refused to stop preparing for a danger everyone else had dismissed as folklore. For the first time in her life, she found herself wanting to learn more about Earth, not as a footnote in her trade law curriculum, but as the story of a people who had done what her own ancient, powerful civilization had failed to do for 300 years. They had actually listened to the warning, and they had actually been ready when it mattered most. 3 weeks after the battle, the assembly hall looked exactly the same as it always had. The same impossibly high ceiling, the same soft blue light glowing from walls grown in orbit over 300 years. The same tiered seating filled with delegates from over 200 species. But the mood inside it had changed, in a way that no architecture could disguise. Elena Voss stood on the black glass platform for what felt like the 100th time in 2 years, except this time, when she looked out across the assembled delegations, she did not see boredom or dismissal, or the careful, condescending patience of powers who believed they had nothing left to learn from a species barely 20 years into the stars. She saw something closer to respect, uneasy in places, still tinged with old habits of superiority in others, but real and hard-won, and impossible to take back now that it had been earned in the only currency that had ever truly mattered to this assembly: results. "Ambassador Voss," Doros Kell said from his seat above the platform, his 4 eyes steady and fully synchronized in a way Elena had rarely seen from him before. "The assembly has reviewed the final reports from the Thren Prime engagement, along with the casualty figures from New Meridian and the battle itself. Before we proceed to the day's business, this body wishes to formally record its recognition of Earth's actions, and to correct an error that should never have been allowed to stand for as long as it did." He rose from his seat, an unusual gesture for the presiding speaker during a formal session, and stepped down toward the platform himself, standing beside Elena rather than above her. 2 years ago, when Earth's delegation first joined this assembly, This body treated your species with a dismissiveness that I am ashamed to have participated in myself. We called your warnings alarmist. We called your instruments unreliable. We called the Threll extinction, the very danger that destroyed your colony and nearly destroyed my own homeworld, a children's story, unworthy of this assembly's serious attention. He paused, his translated voice carrying a weight that no machine could fully replicate, but which came through nonetheless. I was wrong. This entire assembly was wrong, and I do not believe an apology, however sincere, can fully account for the cost of that error, measured in the lives lost at New Meridian, and in the lives that would have been lost at Thren Prime, had Earth waited for our permission before acting. Applause was not a common gesture in the assembly hall, given the wide variety of physical forms represented among its delegates, many of whom had no hands to clap or no ears to hear the sound if they did. But a low, rhythmic thrumming rose across the chamber instead, the closest equivalent gesture that 200 species could produce in unison, a sound Elena had never heard in this hall before, and would likely never hear again outside a moment as significant as this one. She let it continue for a moment before raising a hand, and the sound gradually faded. "Speaker Kell," she said, "members of the assembly, I appreciate this recognition, and I will carry it back to my government, and to the families of New Meridian, and to Admiral Cho, and every crew member who fought at Thren Prime. But I did not come to this platform today to accept an apology on behalf of 2,588 people who are no longer alive to hear it themselves." She let that land, watching several delegations shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I came here to propose something more useful than an apology, something that might actually prevent the next New Meridian, wherever and whenever it happens, to whichever species this assembly is inclined to underestimate next." The proposal Elena laid out that day would become known, in the years that followed, as the Threll Accord, named for the ancient extinction event that had finally forced 200 species to reckon with a danger they had spent 3 centuries dismissing as myth. It established a permanent, standing early warning network, funded jointly by every member species according to their means, monitored continuously by a rotating consortium of scientists and engineers drawn from across the assembly, rather than left to any single species to detect and report alone. It created a rapid response protocol, allowing any credible threat, once confirmed by the monitoring consortium, to trigger immediate defensive coordination without requiring a full assembly vote, a change that would have saved 11 critical days at New Meridian, and might have prevented the loss of 12,000 lives entirely. And it formally recognized Earth's war fleet, no longer as an unsanctioned, secretly built force that had acted without the Assembly's permission, but as the founding core of a new, permanent joint defense force, one that other species were now invited, rather than merely permitted, to contribute ships, resources, and personnel toward building further. The vote passed with a margin that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier, 194 in favor, only 3 opposed, the rest abstaining for reasons that had nothing to do with doubting the threat, and everything to do with old political disputes unrelated to the crisis itself. Ambassador Rule of the Drask, who had once warned Elena that species who cried wolf too often eventually found no one listening, approached her after the session ended, his suit hissing softly as he inclined his head in a gesture of formal respect. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "I believe I owe you a more personal apology than the one Speaker Kell offered on behalf of this entire body. I told you that species who cry wolf too many times find their voices carrying less weight. I did not consider the possibility that a species might cry wolf exactly once, be ignored anyway, and then simply go build the tools to fight the wolf themselves, without ever needing to ask for our belief at all." Elena studied him for a long moment, remembering the condescension in his voice 2 years ago, in this same hall, and finding, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no need to hold on to the resentment any longer. "Ambassador Rule, I've spent 2 years learning that this galaxy moves slowly, weighted down by centuries of habit and caution that most of you have never had reason to question. Earth is still young enough that we haven't learned all your caution yet, for better and for worse. I hope the Threll Accord means we won't have to learn it the hard way again, the way we learned it at New Meridian." "As do I, Ambassador," Rule said. "As do I." 6 months later, Admiral Rebecca Cho stood on a small rise overlooking the rebuilt spaceport at New Meridian, watching the first wave of returning colonists disembark from a transport ship, families who had fled the original attack now coming home to rebuild what had been lost. Protected this time by a permanent garrison of ships drawn not just from Earth's fleet, but from a dozen other species who had, in the wake of the Thren Prime battle, finally understood exactly what New Meridian's loss had actually cost, and exactly what it would take to make sure it never happened again. Elena Voss stood beside her, having flown out personally for the ceremony marking the colony's official reopening, the first major event held under the new Threll Accords Joint Defense Framework. 2,588 names, Cho said quietly, looking toward the small memorial that had been erected near the spaceport's entrance. A simple black stone wall, inscribed with every name of every person lost in the original attack. I still think about that number every day. I probably always will. You should, Elena said, not unkindly. But you should also think about the 12,000 who lived, because you'd already spent 6 years preparing for a threat nobody else believed was real. And you should think about the billions on Thren Prime who never had to become a second entry on a memorial wall like this one, because you didn't stop preparing, even when an entire assembly told you your warnings were nothing more than a children's story. Cho was quiet for a long moment, watching a young family, parents and 2 children, step off the transport ship and onto New Meridian's soil for the first time in nearly a year, their faces a complicated mixture of grief and hope that Elena suspected would define this colony's rebuilding for a long time to come. Do you think the galaxy's actually changed? Cho asked finally. Or did we just get lucky, catching them in a moment scared enough to finally listen? Elena considered the question seriously, thinking back over 2 years of dismissal, followed by weeks of crisis, followed by the strange, uneasy respect that had settled over the assembly hall in the months since. I think galaxies, like people, don't change all at once, no matter how big the crisis. I think this assembly is still going to be slow, and cautious, and sometimes foolish, the same way it always was. But I also think there are 200 species out there now who watched Earth keep a promise nobody believed we could keep, and who understand, in a way they didn't before, that being young doesn't mean being wrong. That's not everything, but it's something worth building on. Above them, in the pale gold sky over New Meridian, a formation of patrol ships moved in slow, steady orbit, part human, part Thren, part a dozen other species who had once looked at Earth's warnings with polite, dismissive amusement, and now flew alongside its fleet, as partners rather than skeptics. It was not a perfect peace, and it was not a guarantee that the galaxy's oldest, hardest lessons had been fully learned. But it was, Elena thought, watching the families below continue stepping off their transport ship and onto ground that had once gone dark and silent under an enemy no one had believed was real. Exactly the kind of small, hard-won progress that mattered most. Not applause in a grand hall, not formal apologies read aloud beneath ancient stone ceilings, but simply people coming home, protected this time, because someone had finally listened before it was too late. Marcus Webb, still stationed at what remained of Deep Space Monitoring Station 7, watched the ceremony's live feed from his console, his coffee, for once, still warm beside his elbow. Priya Nagata stood behind him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder, the same small gesture of reassurance she had offered him weeks earlier, before the battle, before they had known for certain whether any of this would end in anything other than another empty, silent world. "We did it," Marcus said quietly, watching the families disembark on his screen. "We did," Priya agreed, "but Marcus, keep those sensors running. The galaxy's a big place, and I have a feeling this won't be the last time we're the first ones to see something coming." Marcus nodded, turning back to his console, back to the quiet, patient work of watching the dark between the stars for whatever might come next. Somewhere out there, in the vast unmapped reaches of a galaxy that had finally learned, at great cost, to take a young species seriously, humanity's war fleet stood ready, not to conquer, not to dominate, but simply to make sure that the next warning, whenever and wherever it came, would never again go unheard. The assembly hall's ancient light would keep glowing, blue and cold, for centuries to come, a place built to make small things feel smaller. But for the first time in Earth's short history among the stars, humanity no longer felt small standing beneath it. They had earned their place, not through the slow, patient accumulation of centuries the way every other species in that hall had, but through 6 years of quiet preparation, one desperate warning, and a single, decisive battle that the galaxy would remember for a very long time. They had warned the galaxy. The galaxy had not listened. And when it mattered most, humanity had sent its war fleet anyway. A year after the battle at Thren Prime, Elena Voss stood once more on the black glass platform at the center of the assembly hall, though this time the occasion was not a crisis, but a quiet, formal ceremony marking the first anniversary of the Threll Accord's founding. Delegates from every corner of the galaxy had gathered, not to argue or debate, but simply to mark the moment when 200 species had finally agreed that no warning, however young or unfamiliar the voice delivering it, should ever again be dismissed without proper investigation. Sela Korth was there too, no longer a nervous student cramming for a history examination, but a young researcher, newly attached to the Threll Accord's monitoring consortium, having spent the past year studying everything she could find about the battle that had nearly claimed her homeworld and about the species that had saved it. She approached Elena after the ceremony, a little shy, clutching a data tablet full of questions she had been saving for months. "Ambassador Voss," she said, "I know you must be very busy, but I wanted to say thank you. In person, if I could. I was asleep the night the battle happened. I didn't even know there was danger until it was already over. I keep thinking about how easily that could have gone differently, if your people hadn't already been watching, already been ready." Elena studied the young Thren woman for a moment, remembering, with a small ache, the 12,000 people who had not had the luxury of 11 days' warning before New Meridian fell, and the 2,500 who had not made it out in time, even with that warning. "You don't need to thank me, Sela. Thank the people who spent 6 years building a fleet nobody believed would ever be needed. Thank the scientists who kept refining sensor arrays even when this assembly called their data unreliable. And if you really want to repay it, do the work you're doing now. Keep watching. Keep listening. Make sure that the next time somebody tries to raise a warning that sounds impossible, this galaxy doesn't take 2 years and 1 dead colony to decide it's worth taking seriously." Sela nodded, her expression solemn in a way that reminded Elena, briefly, of every young officer she had ever watched grow into the weight of responsibility. "I will, Ambassador, I promise." As the ceremony wound down and delegates began filing out of the Great Hall, Elena found herself standing for a moment, beside Doros Kell, both of them looking up at the towering pillars of grown stone that had once made her feel so small, 2 years ago, on her very first visit to this chamber. "Do you ever wonder, Ambassador," Kell said quietly, "what might have happened if this assembly had simply listened the first time you stood on that platform? If we had authorized those sensor buoys immediately, or launched a proper investigation into the Threll extinction the moment your people first raised the alarm?" Elena considered the question, thinking of New Meridian's dark, silent spaceport, of the black stone memorial wall bearing 2,588 names, of a colony now slowly, carefully rebuilding itself under the protection of a fleet that had been built in secret because no one else believed the danger was real. "I try not to dwell on it too much, Speaker Kell," she said finally. "What's done is done, and no amount of wondering brings back the people we lost. What matters now is what this assembly does with the lesson it finally learned. If the Threll Accord means the next warning gets taken seriously on day 1, instead of day 1,000, then New Meridian's loss, terrible as it was, will have bought something real for every world that comes after it." She looked out across the vast glowing hall, filled now not with dismissal or condescension, but with the quiet, hard-won respect of 200 species who had finally learned to listen. "That's the only kind of answer I know how to give a question like that. We can't undo what happened. We can only make sure it teaches this galaxy something it never forgets again." Doros Kell nodded slowly, his 4 eyes, for once, perfectly still and perfectly in agreement with one another. "Then let us make certain it never does," he said. "For New Meridian, for Thren Prime, and for every world this assembly has not yet learned to listen to." Outside the assembly hall, beneath a sky filled with the ships of a dozen different species flying together for the first time in this galaxy's long history, humanity's warfleet continued its quiet, steady watch, no longer a secret built in the shadows of Jupiter's moons, but a promise kept in the open, for anyone brave enough, or desperate enough, to finally believe in it.